All right. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to, I almost said Freology Friday. Welcome to Sunday Morning Live. I'm your host, Aaron Tomlinson. Today, I want to talk about I want to talk about faith again, and I want to talk about faith as it relates to metaphysics. So I'm going to give people a chance to jump on. If you're watching live, I appreciate it. If you're watching by replay, please let me know. And I'm just going to check a couple things really quick here. Hope everybody's doing well. Had a good weekend. Enjoying the fall. It's officially fall now, right? So let's see something here real quick. Sorry, I'm still trying to figure out how to change the settings on this. Facebook changed some stuff for me. For me. Okay, let me try one more thing. Yeah, just doesn't let me change the setting anymore. Not sure why. Okay. See a couple people have jumped on, so let's go ahead and jump into this. Good morning, Jeanette. Sometimes I can see the comments, sometimes I can't. Don't know why. Hope everybody's doing well. So last week I talked about faith and reframing faith and talked about how there's a difference between beliefs, let's just say, beliefs about the nature of reality. We're going to talk a lot about the nature of reality. How do we know the nature of reality and some things like that? I'm going to talk about that today, but I wanted to start by just talking about the difference between beliefs and faith from the perspective of experiencing things or having access to resources. So here's my thesis. Faith gives us access to resources that are beyond the physical. We have access to all kinds of physical resources, and I think we should avail ourselves to every physical resource that we have. But what a lot of people don't know is that we have a lot of access to spiritual resources, to spirit, or to non-physical resources, things that absolutely exist and absolutely work. I know beyond any shadow of a doubt, I have no doubt about that whatsoever. But a lot of people in our culture, especially in this Western materialized physicalist culture that's dominated by secular humanism, don't know about spiritual resources. And if they do, they don't really know how to access those resources on a consistent basis. And my thesis, my premise is that faith is a requirement in order to access spiritual resources, in order to change our lives, in order to bring real results into our lives and into what we're doing, whether it's healing, whether it's for uh, financial benefit, whether it's related to a relationship, any problem that we have. In order to solve that problem, we have to apply resources that we weren't applying to solve that problem. So, for example, if you're unhealthy, like I was a year ago, then it was necessary for me to avail myself to medical resources. So I went into the hospital. I had a electrocardioversion done to reset my heart rate. Lots of just changing my diet, my lifestyle, getting back in the gym, doing more physical exercise. That's all looking at a problem. The problem was the heart health, or the condition that I had gotten myself into, and looking at what physical resources were available to apply to solve the problem. And that's perfectly appropriate, and we do that all the time. In fact, you can't solve a problem without applying resources that you weren't applying. In the case of what I'm just talking about with my own health, I had to apply the resources of medicine, medical procedures, as well as changing the way that I ate, changing the way, getting out of a sedentary lifestyle. All of that stuff is accessing physical resources that I had not been accessing. in order to apply to the problem, which was my illness, in order to solve the problem and bring me into health. However, I contend that all of us have access to spiritual resources, but in the same way that I would need information, education, motivation, and application to the physical resources, if I didn't know they were available to me, if I didn't know that exercise would improve my cardio health, then I wouldn't know to take the steps. But most importantly, I would have to take those steps and I would have to apply it and apply it on a consistent basis before I would see results. And so my contention is that we have access, that there is a whole spiritual unseen world out there that we have access to, that we also need information, education, and application in order to bring those resources and apply them to whatever problems we may be facing in our lives in order to get those results. And my thesis today is that faith is absolutely essential. But I want to be clear that when I'm talking about faith, I'm talking specifically about expectant faith versus just beliefs, how I believe about the nature of reality, whether I believe there's a God or isn't a God, whether I believe that we have souls or don't have souls, whether I believe that there's life before this life or life after this life. These are all metaphysical questions. So don't let the term metaphysics or metaphysical throw you off. It's simply a arena of philosophy, metaphysics is, that seeks to understand the nature of reality beyond physicalism or beyond naturalism or beyond physics. The prefix meta can mean to go beyond. In this case, that's what it means, to go beyond the physical. And faith is absolutely essential to accessing metaphysical resources. Now, how do I know this? I know this primarily from 30 years of experience and applying what I would call expectant faith to situations, accessing resources through the application of that expectant faith, and then most importantly, seeing the results after the fact. So this makes us think a little bit about what we believe about the nature of reality. And how do we know? So I'm going to get into philosophy today, but I want to make it simple. So don't be intimidated by that. Don't think, that it's something that's difficult to understand. And don't think that it's not important, that it's just some kind of side thing that we do when we talk about philosophy. So what is philosophy? I did a video on this a few months ago, I think, a few months back. But philosophy simply answers for us the question or the questions about what is the nature of the reality in which we find ourselves. What is it? What is the nature of reality? And we're all answering that question. We're either doing it consciously and with information, or we're doing it unconsciously and by programming. In other words, we've been programmed since the day we were born to think a certain way about the nature of reality. And that's going to depend a lot on the family, the culture, the ethnicity that we were born into. So in our case, we are born into a culture that is primarily naturalistic. And even our religions, I would contend, today are naturalist religions. Now, that may sound like a contradiction, but I'll explain that and unpack that for you in a little bit. So everybody has this sort of philosophical framework that they're bringing to life. And again, I want to stress this. You're either consciously aware of the philosophical assumptions that you're making, and you're informed about those philosophical assumptions, or you simply are operating out of the programming that you've been given from the outside, which is based on limited information and the certain educational systems that we partook of, right? So the educational system in America and I suppose most of the world today, is based almost exclusively on physicalism. It's based on this assumption that the only reality that exists, the only thing that is actually true about the nature of reality, is what exists in time and space and can be experienced, can be observed and verified, and therefore proven through the experience of our bodily senses or of our five physical senses. So the foundation for all science, what we call science today, is observation. What can be observed, what can be measured, what can be repeatable. And if it can be observed and it can be measured and it can be repeatable, then we assume that that is evidence that proves that something is true. But there are definite limitations to that and problems with that. And I think what really bothers me about it and why I keep coming back to it is because so many people who are physicalists, people who are atheists, people who are naturalists, make really strong statements about people who are religious or about religion or about people who believe in metaphysics or people who believe in God. They make very strong statements about those. They make very certain statements about those people. And in many cases, they become intellectually smug and condescending and, quite frankly, scoffing and mocking at anyone who does not subscribe to something that can be proven to be real based on observation or based on something that can be tangible to our bodily senses or to our five physical senses. And for me, that's a very, very narrow category, and it does not do anything to really explain the nature of reality. So before I get into faith, let's just talk about physicalism for a minute. Let's just talk about science for a minute. Science is based on a philosophical assumption. Again, it's an assumption, a philosophical category. It categorizes reality and tells us this is all there is. And the only thing that can really be trusted is what science has shown to be true. The problem with science is that it is categorically limited to the physics and has no category to even think about the metaphysics. Here's the other thing people won't tell you about science when they're saying, well, science this and science that and science the other thing, and I just trust science. The other thing that they won't tell you is that science really is not designed, nor does an educated scientist, an actual scientist, if they're honest, say that science is designed to tell us anything about the nature of reality. Science is actually designed to tell us how what we already know about the nature of reality behaves, how it acts, what it does. So to understand this, we don't need to go any further than medicine. Then let's just talk about medicine. I'm not talking about like prescription drugs or interventions in the medical community. I'm just talking about the whole foundation and basis for medicine to start with. So before you get treatment, before you get medication, before you get any kind of intervention, there first has to be a diagnosis. And then from that diagnosis, there is a prognosis. Here's what you can expect without medical intervention. And here's what you can expect with various different treatment protocols that we know to work because they have been rigorously studied in laboratory settings. They've been rigorously studied in human trials, and those studies have passed through what's called a statistical analysis and a peer review, meaning other scientists, other people in the medical field that specialize, reviewed the process and said, yes, this process is rigorous, and so therefore these results can be trusted and these results are accurate. So if you go to the doctor and they give you a diagnosis and then they give you a prognosis, whatever that may be, the prognosis for my situation last year was not good. In other words, they would say, people with this condition, I think 87% die within 5 years, 50% or something, I don't remember the exact numbers, die within the first year, and it's considered to be curable. So all of that is based solely upon these studies that have been published and peer reviewed. Now, what happens is when the doctor gives you a prognosis, they set the frame for your expectation. Here's what you can expect. But what we never ask ourselves is, where does that frame come from? Where does that frame of expectation originate from? And it originates from scientific studies. Now, the other thing that happens, especially when you talk about the paranormal, the metaphysical, the supernatural, people will share their stories. They'll share what they experienced. They'll share what they thought it was that they experienced. And people will say, well, that's anecdotal. That's simply what they call anecdotal evidence. So what's an anecdote? An anecdote, by definition, is simply a one personal story about something. So I had, what do they call it? Extremely severe heart failure, whatever. I was in bad shape, right? Today, I'm completely healthy. I feel better than I've felt in really quite literally decades. I'm probably healthier than I've been in decades, and I'm completely off the medications. So all of my symptoms have resolved. So from my perspective, I've been cured of something that was incurable. However, my experience is considered anecdotal simply because, by definition, it wasn't part of a medical study that then got published in a medical journal. So my story gets lost in terms of prognosis. This is really important to anyone who's facing a medical challenge or a health challenge, because you need to understand that your prognosis is not the same as a predictor of your outcome. I'm going to say it again. The prognosis is not the same as a predictor of an outcome. I would venture to guess that no matter what condition you're dealing with in your body, there have been many people, not just a few, many people who have been healed, who may be even on medical record that they've been healed, but those medical records are never included in the studies that formed the basis for the prognosis to begin with. Hopefully I didn't lose you with all that. I'm just trying to show you the limitations of science and how ridiculous it is. I think it's totally ridiculous, but how limiting it is. Let's be nice. Let's be nice. How limiting it is, how much you're limiting yourself to a very narrow sliver of what you can experience as a human being if you make science your religion, or you make science your authority, or you just simply choose to operate on the basis of physicalism. Now, for people that want to do that, it's fine. I don't think there's any eternal consequences to being a physicalist. I don't think there's any afterlife consequences, let's say, to whether or not you've experienced something metaphysical. But you are cutting yourself off. I believe firmly that a person is cutting themselves off from a whole world of resources and a fuller picture of the actual and real and truthful understanding of the nature of reality. So let me ask you this question. How many of you out there have ever participated in a medical trial? You would know, because you have to sign up, you have to give consent, and then you would be part of at least one of three groups. You'd be a part of a group that's getting the treatment but don't know if you're getting the treatment or if you're getting a placebo. You're a part of a group that's getting a placebo, but you don't know if you're getting the placebo or the treatment, or you're part of a control group that isn't getting any treatment at all. And this is another limitation that medicine has, because there are ethical concerns here. I mean, think about it. If you've got a condition in your body and you're signing up for a medical study, you may end up in the control group, which means you may not get any medical intervention whatsoever. Or you may end up in the placebo group, in which case it's leveraging the power of your belief, your expectant faith that it's going to work. And oftentimes it does, which is scientific evidence that expectant faith works. But somehow we seem to neglect that or forget about that. But you can see the ethical dilemmas there, where you've got a group that could receive treatment, it could improve their health or even save their lives, but they can't get it because it has to go through this medical study, right? So if you've been part of a medical trial, you would have had all of that explained to you. You would have signed paperwork and you would have signed up for the medical trial. Now, here's the second problem. Even if you participate in a medical trial, how many of those studies, after the study is done, passes through a peer review process and actually gets published so that it becomes part of the body of knowledge from which medical providers can draw in order to say that it was valid? Because more studies are oftentimes fail the peer review process and don't get published than do. So you can see how it just gets smaller and smaller and smaller. But just to make it simple, think about how many times you've been healed of something and you didn't participate in any kind of medical trial. This could be as simple as taking antibiotics for an infection. We know that antibiotics work for an infection. However, by definition, if you took antibiotics, let's say for strep throat, and you got healed, that technically, by definition, is considered anecdotal evidence. So when people are, thinking about these things or talking about these things, and they say, well, your story's anecdotal, it's really dishonest to just dismiss it as untrue because it's anecdotal. But we do these things as human beings. I'm just trying to show you the limitations of science. Now, philosophy, on the other hand, says we're going to seek to apply logic and reason in order to understand the nature of reality, what can be known about the nature of reality. That's the first layer of philosophy. And the second layer of philosophy, which is really important to what we're going to get into with faith here in a minute, has to do with how do we know what we know? Again, this is a question that you either answer thoroughly, consciously, with awareness. How do I know what I know? Or it's something you've just been programmed to accept and you never think about those things. How do I know what I know? And so it's always been important to me, even though I know it probably doesn't make me the most entertaining person on social media to listen to or whatever, but it's always been important to me to look at how do we know what we know? And so a lot of people in spiritual circles, especially, don't really know how they know, and they don't really tell you how they know. And if they do, it's completely based on their own personal experience, anecdotal. Already said, anecdotal evidence is very valid. Or it's based on their intuitions. They just think this. They just came up with this. They just feel it. They just sense it. And that's fine. I firmly believe in intuition, firmly believe in all of that stuff. However, when it comes to exporting that to other people, as this is the way it is, it takes an extreme amount of arrogance to say my intuition is correct, but someone else's intuition is wrong. I was one of the first people, as far as I know, to talk about, do I want to get into that? Okay, so someone could say, I had a vision, a dream, an experience with Jesus. And that may have convinced them personally of the reality of Jesus and maybe even the reality of their Christian faith based on their experience. And they may try, and often will, try to export that, not out of any kind of malicious intent or malevolence on their part. They're just excited about this discovery and this experience that they had. And it'd be very natural for them to think that other people can or maybe even should have those same experiences, or based on my experience, you should take my word for it. And therefore, you should apply the same principles, the same morals, the same belief system to your life that I'm applying to my life. And any of us that have deconstructed would say that's insufficient and even inappropriate to tell someone else these things. Yet, on the other side, are the very same people who will tell you about their intuitions about it, their experiences about it, and they will criticize and dismiss people who say they've had experiences with Jesus and then say, but no, I know this is the way because I've reached a higher vibration, because I've reached a certain level of revelation or illumination. Well, you're expecting us to apply what you're saying to our lives based on your experience while criticizing millions of other people who take what they've experienced and apply it to themselves. And some people even have the audacity to go one step further and to tell people what they experienced. This is called gaslighting. This is called gaslighting. Anytime I try to make someone question their own reality, I'm not talking about challenging. I'm not talking about reasoning through something. I'm not talking about, well, have you considered this? But when someone says, I had an experience with Christ, I had an experience with Jesus, or I had an experience with Buddha, or I had an experience with the angel Gabriel, or I experienced demonic possession or whatever. And we come along and say, no, that's not right. That's a fragmented part of your soul that has just jumped off or that you're split off from. Think about the level of absolute arrogance that takes. That's completely gaslighting. You weren't there. You didn't have the experience. You are not qualified to clinically tell someone their psychological, mental, or emotional condition, yet you do it without even blushing. I don't even know what to say about that. So how do we make sense of all this? How do we unpack all this? Because what I'm saying is that we have to apply something besides just our intuition if we're going to tell people this is the nature of reality. We have to provide reasonable evidence, or at least say, this is how I know that I know. Now, I can say I know this intuitively. I know this by the spirit. I know this by revelation. I know this by higher vibration or illumination or revelation or ascension or whatever the case may be. However, then we have to make allowances for other people's intuitive faculties as well. Otherwise, we're saying my intuitive faculties are right and your intuitive faculties are wrong. And so therefore, you're actually falling into the same exact error that you're criticizing everybody else for doing who's involved in Christianity. And we don't realize it. We're blind to it. So no, you're not illuminated. You're not awakened. You're not. And I'm just saying, like, I'm trying to help people who are trying to sort through all of this. And so what I'm suggesting is that if you really want a good foundation, if you really want something with substance, then it's important for you and for me to think through how did I arrive at my conclusions about the nature of reality, and how do I know what I know? What's the basis or what's the foundation for that? So what I want to do for the rest of our time together, if you're still with me, is to talk about how faith is essential to accessing spiritual resources in order to experience outcomes that would be supernatural based upon the prevailing wisdom of the day and the cultural consensus that we all live under, that naturalism is really all there is. So to do that, I'm going to turn to the Bible, but I'm not asking anybody to accept anything that I'm saying as real or true or factual, or that you should live your life by this just because it's in the Bible. By the same token, I'm not saying the Bible has authority. This is the word of God. I'm not saying that. And so therefore you should believe it. But at the same time, I'm not going to dismiss something that I think we can look at and analyze and critically think through that can help us arrive at a place where we can apply faith to our lives, expectant faith to our lives, in order to get results just because it's in the Bible and it's all BS, right? So I'm trying to be very measured. and thoughtful. And I'm not asking you to accept or believe anything. I'm just offering to you how I've thought through these things and inviting you to examine it from the same perspective and see how it might apply to your life. And then, most importantly, to test it and prove it to see how it works in your life. We're far too quick to jump to conclusions about the nature of reality, especially when it comes to spiritual things. We're far too quick to jump to the conclusions. We're far too anecdotal in that sense, meaning that, what I'm saying about anecdotal is just because it's anecdotal doesn't mean it's wrong, but just because it's anecdotal also doesn't mean that it's right. All of us have to do some of this work if we want to have a good foundation and we want to have something that will withstand tests and trials. Now, I made a statement at the beginning where I said that even our religions and even our spirituality, even in spiritual circles, we are essentially, in many ways, naturalistic. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that a lot of people can buy into, believe in passionately the existence of God. They can believe, if they're Christian, in the lordship of Jesus. They can believe the miracles that are written in the Bible. They can believe in Jesus as healer, deliverer, savior, whatever the case may be. But in the application of it in their lives, they don't see any proof of it. My prayers don't get answered. Supernatural experiences and interventions aren't something that's part of my personal history or part of my personal experience. The only thing that I have to reference in my personal experience is physicalism. So therefore, physicalism is going to trump, at least from a pragmatic perspective, and I'll get into pragmatism in a minute. Naturalism trumps that. So even places that I used to go that believed in healing and believed it was for today and believed that the gifts of the Spirit were for today, didn't see it. And there are a lot of groups, don't forget, that don't believe that the gifts of the Spirit are for today. There are a lot of people that believe that that was only for the apostolic period. That was only to prove historically that the writings that we have are authentic and God doesn't, the age of miracles has ceased. The age of the supernatural has ceased in the Christian church. That's a naturalistic position. Yes, we believe in God, we believe in soul, we believe in the afterlife, but God doesn't do anything to intervene in our lives today. And if he does, it's once in a while, and it's basically a crapshoot, literally, like a crapshoot. So they're embracing a naturalist philosophy, and they're basing it on their experience. We don't see answers to prayer. We don't see healings. We don't see this kind of stuff happening. And then there are other people that say, we believe it's for today. We believe that God still does these things today. We believe in Jesus as healer, or we believe in financial miracles, and we teach this and we encourage people to practice this, but we never see it. We never see it, which means that in your own experience, you're still a naturalist, even though in your beliefs, you may not be. Faith is something else. So let's look at really what I think is the best definition of faith in the Bible. And the author here, whoever it is, it's in the book of Hebrews, chapter 11, is making philosophical statements, making statements about the nature of reality. And then also in here, but we miss it because a lot gets lost in translation, also giving reasons, or this is how we know. So this is what we know, and this is how we know. And it's all just in a few statements here in Hebrews 11. So I'm going to read, let's say the first few verses of chapter 11. We'll see how far I go. So New King James Version says, now faith is, so this is the nature of faith, the nature of reality, the nature of faith. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen, for by it the elders obtained a good testimony. By faith, I don't like that translation, that's why I did that, but I'll come back to it. By faith, we understand that the worlds were framed by the word of God, so that things which are seen were not made of things which are visible. Faith is the substance of things hoped for. That's what it is. It's the evidence of things not seen. That's what it is. For by it the elders obtain a good report. We'll come back to that. By faith we understand that the worlds, the universes, the multiverse, the ages were framed, set in place by the word of God, so that things which are seen were not made of things which can be observed, of things which were visible. Now, let's break this down somewhat in the original languages. And I've done a lot of study on this. I can give you my resources I'll try to do that. The Theological Dictionary of New Testament Words is probably the most expansive resource available to lay people for understanding what these words mean. Let's start with the word substance. Faith is the substance of things hoped for. The word substance there is a Greek word, hypostasis. Hypostasis. And if you look it up strictly in like a Strong's Concordance or Vine's Dictionary, or Google the meaning online, or listen to the average preacher, or even read some of the translations like the New American Standard or the New Revised Standard Version. Some of those translations say it's the confidence of things hoped for. It's the belief in things hoped for. But Cattell's Theological Dictionary of New Testament Words has some interesting commentary on this. And then I researched it out beyond Cattell. But again, I want to tell you how I know what I know. So faith is a substance, hypostasis. Now, if you look this up in Strong's, Vine's, hypostasis, it literally means something that stands beneath, like a foundation, or something that stands behind something, like someone who's wearing a costume. You have the costume, the thing which is seen, and then you have the person, which in this case would be the hypostasis, that which is standing behind or within the costume, but is not seen. A foundation to building our house is holding it up. It's standing underneath it, but it can't be seen. And so actually this word hypostasis was a philosophical term to describe the nature of reality. And so here was the understanding of the nature of reality back then. And it's very similar to the nature of reality that we have today, that physical sciences have arrived at through quantum physics. So this idea of hypostasis was that nature, all of nature, is made out of unseen realities, that all visible realities, everything in the physical world, has a substance. It's kind of a bad word, but we're limited by language. Has an essence, has a reality that stands behind it that cannot be seen. A field, if you will. So when we get into quantum physics, we understand that there is a quantum field that we cannot see, but that is actually what makes up our reality. Things like molecules, atoms, photons, all that stuff, right? We understand the nature of reality at the quantum level, the microscopic, the very, very small particle level, is very different than what's presented to our senses. And there's a lot of good quantum theory that talks about a quantum field that connects everything together. I talked about this in my last episode. So you go back last week and watch that one if you want to for more on that. So faith is a substance. Faith is something. Faith is a thing that is actually what's behind the nature of reality. That's what hypostasis is. And in this case, it's the hypostasis. It's that which is standing behind what we are hoping for. And the word hope there, let's change the translation a little bit, because hope in our culture can mean something very, very different. Oftentimes we talk about hopes and dreams, and I'm hoping for this. And oftentimes our hopes are left like dust in the wind, right? They don't materialize for us. They don't manifest for us. That's not what he's talking about here. He's not talking about that kind of hope. He's talking about expectancy, things that we expect to happen. So by this definition, we're talking about expectant faith. I talked about that a lot last week as well, expectant faith. So I believe in the possibility that this can happen. And I believe that this is possible, not just for someone else to experience, but I believe this is possible also for me to experience. And we get closer to the definition here from Hebrews 11 about what faith is. Faith is the invisible force that stands behind what we are expecting to happen. If there is no faith in what we're expecting to happen, there is no substance, there's no foundation to it, there's nothing standing behind it. It's simply an empty costume, if you will, or an empty set of clothes, if you don't like the term costume, right? There's nothing standing behind it. There's nothing energizing it. There's nothing that's going to cause it to come to pass in your life. So again, this is where we can look at a lot of our religious experience. There may have been a lot of belief, but there wasn't a lot of faith because there wasn't anything happening. There was no substance behind what we expected. And I'm just at a place in my life where I want to be able to experience the goods and I want to be able to deliver on those goods. In other words, I don't think, that talking about spirituality or thinking about these things has any benefit to our lives whatsoever, other than we get bored and it's an intellectual exercise for us or something. But if it doesn't have the ability to deliver manifestation, if it doesn't give us access to resources that are unseen in order to apply to our problems, to actually solve our problems, then it's really of no tangible benefit to us whatsoever. And so it's just an intellectual exercise that we go through back and forth with one another, and not something that really, like I said, can deliver on the goods. And so I want to be interested in what can deliver on the goods, which brings me to the next part of this, which is the evidence of things not seen. The evidence of things not seen. Now, this is also a very interesting word that gets mistranslated because we don't understand the philosophical statements that are being made here, because we don't understand the philosophical culture in which this is being written, because we weren't taught that in school, because somehow philosophy didn't have any benefit because we're physicalists. Anyway, I'll get off my hobby horse there. It's just, you could tell it grinds my gears. The word evidence here is the word pragma, P-R-A-G-M-A, the Greek word pragma. Pragma might sound like a word that I've used and that you may have heard, pragmatic or pragmatist or pragmatism. Again, don't get lost in the words, because these may be new or familiar or unfamiliar to you. What is pragmatism? Pragmatism is a philosophical approach to life that specifically relates to metaphysics. What are metaphysics? Metaphysics are simply things which are not seen, things that are not present to us through our bodily senses, through our five physical senses, things that transcend the naturalist physical world, but are still very much a very real and important part of the fabric of reality in which we find ourselves. Faith is the evidence, it's the pragma of those things. This is so important when we start thinking about these topics. Aaron, how can you prove the spirit world exists? There's no proof that God exists. There's no proof of anything spiritual. Anything that we think is spiritual actually isn't spiritual. We just haven't had the time yet for science to figure it out. How many of you have heard that statement? Criticize God of the gaps, or criticize believers, people who have faith, because they don't have answers to certain questions, but then accept at the same time that our answer is, oh, we'll eventually figure it out, we just haven't figured it out yet, is sufficient. It's the kind of mental gymnastics that we do when we try to exclude spirit from our lives. So what I'm saying is is that science cannot demonstrate or prove. It's a straw man argument. It's very much a straw man argument. When people say, well, there's no evidence that spirit exists. There's no evidence for a spiritual world. There's no evidence that God exists. And I'm not here to, make an apologetic or try to get you to believe in God. That's irrelevant to the conversation. I'm just pointing out the flaws in our logic, right? And the flaws in the things that we hear. Because it can be intimidating. If we don't understand stuff, we don't understand quantum physics, we don't understand science as well. And people say, well, there's no evidence. And really what they're leaning on is there's nothing in physics that can tell us about the existence of something beyond or the nature of reality. And it doesn't have to be God. It could be the soul. It could be the afterlife. It could be any of these things that are non-physical, right? But right here in this book, it's saying faith is the evidence, the pragma of things not seen. So there was a group of really smart people in the last century, 20th century, William James being a notable psychologist. You can look him up. Wendell Oliver Holmes, who's one of the most cited Supreme Court justices, and then some other people that I had not heard of, who formed a club that they called the Metaphysics Club. And they fleshed out, they didn't originate the ideas of pragmatism, but they fleshed out a pragmatic philosophy that they took from this Greek word pragma. So, and they said pragmatism, I don't know that they used this verse at all, but they said the same thing. They said the only evidence that we have, the only way we can know, not the only evidence we have, the only way we can actually know the nature of this non-physical reality is through pragma, or through this philosophy that they called pragmatism. What is pragmatism? Pragmatism means, since it's not something that we can observe, since it's not something that we can measure, science cannot tell us about these things. See, science categorically denies anything that's not physical, meaning it doesn't fit into the category. So anything that doesn't fit into that category is automatically dismissed. Absolutely. In peer reviews, in the academies, it doesn't fit that category. So it's not science. It's pseudoscience. It doesn't fit that category. So this is the only way we can know the nature of reality. So therefore, that does not exist. It's really the same as, let's say, a group of people who didn't know about mushrooms, or that they were edible, that they could even be healthy, that they could even be healing. But because they're fungi, they don't consider them food. So they never get studied as food. They never get introduced at all. And so we say, well, that's not really food. See what I'm saying? Because it doesn't fit the category of food because it's a fungi. And we don't consider fungi to be food. So if all we're saying is only the things, if our philosophical assumption is only the things that we can see, only the things that we can touch, only the things that we can feel define for us are real. Therefore, that defines for us the nature of reality. And until we can discover something that can fit into this category, right? Or until we can discover proof that's completely based on the five physical senses, that something beyond the five physical senses exists. Do you see how that's problematic? So what this group, the Metaphysics Club, did is they said pragmatism is the way that you can know the nature of unseen things, the reality, the reliability of unseen things. Well, what is pragmatism? Pragmatism simply says this. The word pragma comes from a word in the Greek that means action. Philosophically, what it means is if it works, it can be trusted. Does it? It asks a totally different question. Does it work? Is it working for you? How is it working for you? So ironically, most people who were part of faith, part of religion, who deconstructed from it, knowingly or unknowingly, I would venture to guess mostly unknowingly, applied the philosophical principles of pragmatism in order to deconstruct. My prayer life hasn't worked for me. Uh, Judging other people for their sexual orientation or because they believe differently than me has disrupted, in some cases, family relationships. It's disrupted society. It's caused wars. See, they're applying principles of pragmatism. Pragmatically, this doesn't work in our world. What I believe doesn't work for me anymore. It caused shame. It caused trauma. It lacked results. We prayed for things and it never happened. Whatever. You see what I'm getting at. Pragmatically, it didn't work. That's a totally different question. Is this true or not true? What's the evidence that we have for it? Is a completely different question than does this work? Does this get results? Does this deliver the goods? And so, what the writer of Hebrews is saying here, and what pragmatism says, is that we can, and what the Metaphysics Club was saying, is that we can know the nature of the non-physical world. We can know the nature of metaphysics. We can know the nature of spirit and spirits and the, whatever you want to call it, whatever term, the astral plane. We can know about the reality of the larger consciousness system, is what Thomas Campbell calls consciousness. We can know about the afterlife because we've had visitations from loved ones who have passed on, and that helped us. That helped us come to terms with their death. That helped us move through the grief process, right? So it's pragmatic. I know that faith works because I've seen it work over and over again in my life. It works for me. So it's pragmatic. I know that spirit is real because pragmatically, I've seen it work for me in my life. So when I start to apply that question, when I start to ask, is this working or is this not working? And I apply that question to everything that I'm uh, saying and thinking and doing regarding spirituality, because spirituality is great if it works. This is one of the reasons that I shifted in the last year in the way I approach things, because I'm going to tell you right now, naturalism and physicalism and atheism did not work for me. It didn't produce life. It didn't produce peace. It didn't produce joy. It didn't produce benefits for me. I understand that there are some people out there that your experience is very, very different. Great. It'd be great if we could have a discussion based on the pragmatism of it rather than trying to get into the weeds of all the other stuff with it. But for me, it didn't work. When I began to look at the actual scientific evidence that spirituality has an 80% protective benefit in college-age students against severe episodes of depression and a 90% protective benefit against suicidal ideation, I began to say, wow, spirituality is really an important area of our lives. And I can testify from my own experience that I was much happier, much more productive, much more successful, much more healthy, much more effective when I was in the church than when I was out of the church. Now, I have pragmatic reasons for expanding beyond Christian dogma to include the whole range of spirituality. If you were to ask me today, what worldview do I most adhere to from a metaphysical perspective, I would have to answer the basics of the shamanic worldview, or shamanism makes the most sense to me, has the most application, has the most benefit, gets the most results. And I'm able then to frame past Christian experiences within a shamanic framework. To say that Jesus was a shaman or a shamanic healer, Elijah was a shaman, at least as the stories are told, regardless of whether or not they were actual historical people or not. They operated on basis, all the prophets, Jesus. If you take the shamanic worldview and you apply it to them, you can see them as shaman. Where I differ is to dogmatically say they're the only way. They're the only shaman. They're the only spiritual experiences that are valid. Everything else is of darkness. Everything else is of the devil. I don't believe that, right? Okay, so let's come back to faith as the evidence, as the pragmatism of things not seen. In other words, the proof that there are things not seen is faith, real faith, and how well it works as when applied as the substance of things hoped for. In other words, without faith, there is no access, there is no proof, there is no evidence. I'm not talking about intellectual assent. I just accept it by faith. I'm not talking about that at all. I'm talking about applying belief that I can have a different outcome by applying belief that the spiritual world is real, and then through that belief and through that faith, actually experiencing it, and then taking those experiences and applying them to my life in a way that works. That's how we know. That's how we prove metaphysics. Not in a laboratory, not with someone's intuition, not you just take my word for it, or I just take your word for it. But if I take these principles, if I take these ideas, if I take these philosophies and apply them, how well do they work for me? Now, that application has to include a span of time. I knew, based on scientific research, that no matter what condition my heart was, that the right kind of exercise, and I had to be careful how I exercised. This is not medical information for people to take and apply outside of this. I was doing this under the supervision of the doctor. We had actual conversations with the doctor in the doctor's office about what kind of physical activity was appropriate for me and what kind of physical activity was not appropriate for me. So it was supervised by my cardiologist. I want to emphasize that. However, and he suggested go do this type of exercise a couple times a week. Work to the point, if you start to get tired, stop. Now, I was extremely out of shape. My heart was in extremely poor condition. I could barely walk a block. So when I went to the gym the first time, it was embarrassing. If I compared myself to other people, and I'd have to remind myself, yeah, I'm recovering from heart failure. I'm in a different place. But I had to keep going. I couldn't go. I went for 2 months, I think, and there was no improvement in my heart. I went for 8, 9, 10 months, and I was running a 5K. But it took a long application of those things. So the proof in the benefit of the exercise was how I feel, and the running the 5K. It was very pragmatic. However, if I had not applied it over a consistent, if I'd have just judged off of my first month, 2 months, 3 months in the gym, I mean, if I'd have judged after my first time, and this is how people approach metaphysics or faith. I applied it one time, didn't work. I need to, you see what I'm saying? I'm not seeing the results. 3 months in, still not seeing the results. 10 months in, seeing a lot of results. Okay, sure you get the point. And then I want to deal with this last part before I go. For by it the elders obtained a good testimony. By it, by what? By faith. By faith, the elders obtained a good testimony. That sounds like they had faith and God testified about them. That's how I used to read it. They had faith. If you have faith that pleases God, God sees your faith, gives you good testimony. Well done, good and faithful servant. That's not what that's saying at all in the original language. What it's saying in the original language was, by faith, the elders became our witnesses. The word there is where we get it's the same word for witness. It's the same word in Acts where it talks about they went out and they bore witness. The Holy Spirit shall come upon you, and you shall be my witnesses in Judea, Samaria, and to the uttermost parts of the earth. I think that's Acts chapter 1, verse 8. The evidence that the resurrection is real, Jesus is telling his disciples in Acts, the evidence that I rose from the dead is going to be the supernatural power of the Spirit that's going to come upon you. And that power, that demonstration of the Spirit and power that Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, that's going to be the evidence. That's going to be the proof that this stuff is true. It's the same word. So by faith, the elders have left us witness of the reality of metaphysics. So, to sum this all up, my whole point in all of this is to say that we have access to spiritual resources that can be applied to our problems, that can be part of the solution to our problems. And it's a whole realm of resource that we've not been educated about, we've not been instructed about, we've not been taught about. And we can take by faith, access those things, by faith, apply them to expectant outcomes, and see those expectant outcomes happen in our lives. And the evidence that we have to go by that is the testimony of people that have gone before us, their anecdotal testimonies. It requires an element of openness, but not gullibleness or gullibility or the gullibility. Somebody put it in the chat for me. It requires an element of openness. In other words, I have to suspend my skepticism. I have to suspend my cynicism. Nothing can be more toxic to our lives in terms of how productive it is and how effective it is. Nothing can be more toxic to our faith and application of those resources than cynicism and skepticism. We hear something that we don't agree with, that we don't like, that goes against something we've been teaching, and we say, oh, well, that's just bullshit. Family program, sorry. That's cynicism, skepticism. And if you want proof of what I'm saying, that faith is necessary for these things, just ask the cynic how many times they've experienced breakthrough. Ask the skeptic how their skepticism is improving and benefiting their life, right? So skepticism is a closed mind. Skepticism says, you tell me about your experience and I'll tell you more about it because I know whatever you're saying can't be true. Skepticism is automatically approaches it with a no. It's not openness. Openness is a humble position. Openness says, I don't know. I don't know what that is. I'm not sure about the nature of reality, but I'm open. See, that's openness. That's real humility. Prevents you from stepping into gaslighting other people just because their experiences are different than yours or their beliefs are different than yours. So openness is essential, but not gullibility. In other words, we have to stay grounded in the practical application and results. I'm open to it. I want to hear more about it. I want to try it for a fair period of time in my life to see if it works. Just like with the exercise, if I'd have gone the first time, oh, that didn't work. If I'd gone for 3 months, oh, that didn't work. But after 10 months, I could see the proof in it. I could see the fruit in it. I could see how it had benefited my life. If after 10 months it still wasn't working, why would I keep going to the gym? Why would I keep exercising if I hadn't improved my condition at all? Now, of course, there was medicine and other things that were improving my condition as well, but not getting me to the place that I'm at today. Because there were also spiritual resources. And I would say it was the access by faith and the application by faith of spiritual resources that got me the outcome that I did get in my own health and healing. Now, would I expect you to just believe me and just take it as gospel? No, because then you'd be gullible. But if you can hear me with openness and really try to understand what I'm saying instead of trying to tell me what I'm saying, like some people have recently, the people that get in conflict with me and I clarify my position and they say, no, your position's still the position I think it is. Like, that's not an honest person. You can't have honest dialogue with that person. So I had to shut off some dialogue with some people. Right. And that's unfortunate. But what I'm saying is, I'm not expecting anybody to just take my word for it, or just because it worked for me, it's going to work for you. What I'm asking is that what I'm saying is, if you have some openness to this stuff and you get the right kind of information and you get the right kind of education, and then you take it and apply it over a period of time, I think you will discover that it will work for you in situations in much the same way it's worked for me, and not just me, but millions of other people who have had access to spirit and faith and have brought about powerful, life-changing outcomes in their own lives. So it requires openness, a suspension of cynicism and skepticism, but not asking for gullibility, because gullibility, just believe it because I said it, just believe it because the word says it, just believe it because all these other people have said it. Never mind how it works for you. Never mind how it works in your life. Never mind how it applies to your situation. Then I wouldn't be being pragmatic, would I? All right, everybody. Love you guys. Thank you for watching. Appreciate it so much. Appreciate those of you that have supported us and supported me and encouraged me through this process. I realize that I've pivoted. I've moved away from sort of the just cynical, skeptical, angry deconstruction kind of content, talking about what's wrong with something all the time. I'm just pivoted completely away from that. There is a certain dopamine hit that people get. There is from angry posts. It's why we see some of the phenomena that we see in social media today, because there's an actual dopamine hit. There's an adrenaline hit that you get. It's a microdose, but when I come across something that, oh yeah, yeah, oh yeah, that's right. There's a dopamine hit to it, and a lot of people can get addicted to it. And I got addicted to it. That was one of the things I had to break out of. And so I pivoted away. I don't want to create that kind of content anymore. I don't want to. I'm able to reframe my Christian experience, even though it's not something I want to go back to, all of it, but there are elements of it that I want to go back to because they were pragmatic, because they worked. And so now I can reframe my entire past experience, not as something that was toxic or traumatic or harmful in any way. Harmful in some ways. I mean, there were certainly some doctrines and stuff that were harmful and toxic, and there certainly was some trauma and there was some pain and all of that. I'm not denying that. I'm not being Pollyannish about it. But I'm saying that I don't need to focus on those parts anymore. I don't need to look at those parts anymore. I don't need to talk about those parts anymore. I'm not interested in getting a following of people who just want to be on the angry side, the opposing side of something all the time. So I have pivoted. Those of you that still appreciate and enjoy my content, let me know, because I want to do this as part of my service to humanity. I want to spend the rest of my life helping people discover spirit, helping people connect to spirit, helping people connect with faith in order to get supernatural spiritual resources that they can apply in real life situations, prove them out in very difficult real life situations, and see results. So on that note, I'm gonna let you go. Hope you have a great week. Hope you have a great day, and I will see you again probably next week for Sunday Morning Live.